There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of routine, the plain clothes of a Tuesday evening, or a simple drive home. You don't recognize them as watershed events until much later, when you look back and see the timeline of your own heart, cleaved in two, the before and the after. For me, that moment smelled of chlorine and old car upholstery. It was the heavy, waterlogged silence that filled the space between heartbeats after a long practice, a silence I had come to know as a kind of language between Leo and me. But on this night, the language was changing. The familiar grammar of our friendship was beginning to fracture, and I could feel a new, terrifying vocabulary trying to form in the space he had created by simply turning the wheel, killing the engine, and plunging us into a darkness broken only by the indifferent orange glow of a single street lamp in an abandoned strip mall parking lot. We were just driving back from practice, a ritual as ingrained as the morning alarm or the burn of lactic acid in our muscles. And then, we weren't. We were parked, adrift in a sea of cracked asphalt, and he was just staring. Not at me, not yet. He was staring through the windshield at nothing, at a shuttered laundromat, and a sky the color of a deep bruise, and the weight of that stare felt like the pressure of the deep end of the pool, compressing my lungs until I was sure I would forget how to breathe. We had met in water. It felt fitting, in a way, that the foundation of our friendship was laid in an element that could both buoy you up and drag you under. It was the first day of tryouts for the university swim team, a humid, echoing natatorium filled with the nervous energy of 24 hopefuls. I was a photographer first, a swimmer second. I saw the world in frames, in compositions of light and shadow, and the pool was a beautiful subject. The way the overhead lights fractured on the churning surface, the distorted figures moving like ghosts beneath the lane lines, the raw, unvarnished effort on a swimmer's face as they gasped for air. I was there to capture it, and maybe, if I was fast enough, to be a part of it. He was there to conquer it. Leo was all kinetic energy, a tightly coiled spring of muscle and easy confidence. He moved with an unthinking grace, his laughter echoing off the tiled walls in a way that made people turn and smile without knowing why. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just satellites caught in his gravitational pull. I remember watching him on the block, his back a perfect, powerful V, and thinking that he was built by the water, for the water. He dove in, and the world seemed to narrow to his lane. His clean entry, the powerful, rhythmic churn of his freestyle that ate up the distance with an almost insulting ease. I was quiet, observant, more comfortable behind a lens than in the spotlight. My strength was in endurance, in the steady, patient rhythm of a long-distance set, while he was a sprinter, all explosive power and brilliant, fleeting speed. We were opposites, built from different materials, designed for different races. And yet, after the final set, as we all hung on the lane lines, chests heaving, he turned to me. His hair was plastered to his forehead, water streaming down his face, and he grinned a grin so wide and genuine it seemed to light up the whole chlorine-scented cavern. "You've got a hell of a kick," he said, his voice a little breathless. Kept me honest. I was so surprised he'd even noticed me that I could only manage a nod, my own lungs burning too much for words. That was the beginning. It was that simple. A shared exhaustion, a throwaway compliment, a smile that felt like a promise of warmth. Our friendship grew in the liminal spaces of a college athlete's life, in the pre-dawn quiet of the locker room, the droning humidity of the pool deck, the shared meals in the dining hall where we shoveled down mountains of pasta to refuel, and the late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee. We became roommates sophomore year, our lives slotting together with an ease that felt preordained. Our apartment was a comfortable chaos of damp towels, textbooks, and my camera equipment spread across the dining room table. He was the one who dragged me to parties, who forced me to put down my camera and actually talk to people. I was the one who made sure he remembered to eat something other than protein bars, who listened when the pressure of being the team's golden boy became too much. I learned the topography of his moods like a familiar landscape. I knew the subtle downturn of his mouth that meant he was worried about a midterm, the frantic energy that meant he was trying to outrun his own thoughts, and the quiet, bone-deep weariness that settled over him after a disappointing race. I became the silent archivist of his life, not just through my camera lens, but in my memory. I captured the unguarded moments. Leo asleep on the couch with a textbook open on his chest, the fierce concentration on his face as he coded for a computer science project, the way he'd absent-mindedly traced the rim of his coffee mug while lost in thought. These were the images I kept for myself, stored in a gallery no one else would ever see. And somewhere in that quiet observation, my affection for him underwent a chemical change. It deepened, shifted, and transmuted from the simple, solid thing that was friendship into something more complex, more fragile, and infinitely more terrifying. It became a quiet, constant ache in my chest, a love that had nowhere to go, so it settled into the foundations of my being, a secret I guarded more carefully than anything else in my life. He dated, of course. He moved through relationships with the same bright, confident energy he brought to everything else. There was Amy, the art history major, and Chloe, the soccer player, and then, most seriously, there was Sarah. She was smart and funny, and she seemed to understand him in a way the others hadn't. For 2 years, she was a fixture in our lives, a third point in the geography of our apartment. I liked her genuinely. I saw how she made him happy, how she could soothe the restless energy in him, and I learned to perform my role perfectly. I was the supportive friend, the easygoing roommate. I smiled, I made jokes, I listened to him talk about her for hours, and with every word, I felt myself building a taller, thicker wall around my own heart. It was a strange kind of self-preservation. I became an expert at redirection, at turning the conversation, at keeping the focus anywhere but on the space inside me where my feelings for him lived and breathed. I poured it all into my photography, into the water. I found solace in the solitude of a long swim, in the rhythmic pull and push, the muffled silence underwater. It was a place where I could be with the feeling without having to name it, where the burn in my muscles could distract from the ache in my soul. I told myself it was enough. To be in his orbit, to be the person he trusted, to have this deep, unshakable friendship, it had to be enough. To want more was to risk everything, to detonate the foundations of the world we had built. And so I remained the quiet observer, the keeper of a secret that felt both like a precious treasure and a poison I was slowly drinking, day by day. The end with Sarah wasn't a sudden explosion. It was more like a slow, structural collapse. It happened in the autumn of our senior year, a season that already felt heavy with impending change. I came home one evening from a late class to find him sitting on the floor of our living room in the dark, the only light coming from the blue glow of his phone screen, which lay face down beside him. The silence in the apartment was wrong. It wasn't the comfortable, lived-in silence we usually shared. It was a hollow, ringing void. He didn't look up when I came in. He just sat there, his shoulders slumped, and I knew. I didn't have to ask. I just dropped my bag, walked over, and sat down on the floor across from him, mirroring his posture, entering into the silence with him. We sat like that for nearly an hour before he finally spoke, his voice raspy and thin. She said she feels like she doesn't really know me, he whispered to the floorboards. That I keep a part of myself locked away. The most important part, I didn't know what to say. How could I tell him that I understood exactly what she meant? I saw it too. For all his outward charm and sociability, there was a core to Leo that was intensely private, a room he never let anyone enter. He deflected deep emotional intimacy with a joke or a change of subject, keeping the world at a comfortable arm's length. I had always assumed it was just his nature, but hearing it from Sarah, hearing it framed as the reason for their end, it cast a new, melancholic light on the friend I thought I knew so well. That night was the beginning of the shift. The confident, sun-bright Leo the first knew seemed to recede, and in his place was someone quieter, more fragile, and profoundly lost. The breakup didn't just leave him heartbroken. It left him unmoored, as if the anchor that held him to his own sense of self had been cut loose. His loneliness became a physical presence in our apartment. It lingered in the hallways, clung to the furniture. He stopped going out. His easy laughter, once the constant soundtrack of our lives, became a rarity. He'd come home from practice, shower, and then retreat to his room, the click of his door closing feeling like a final, definitive punctuation mark on the day. But the nights were the worst. I would lie in my own bed, the wall between our rooms feeling paper-thin, and I could almost hear the restless energy emanating from his side. I'd hear the creak of his bed as he tossed and turned, the soft sigh of frustration. He, who had always fallen asleep the moment his head hit the pillow, was now haunted by the quiet hours. I was caught in a state of suspended helplessness, wanting to breach the wall between us, to offer some kind of comfort, but terrified of overstepping. Our friendship had always been easy, unspoken. It wasn't built for this kind of heavy, fragile thing. I didn't have the words for it, so I did what I knew how to do. I made sure there was always food in the fridge. I'd leave a plate for him on the counter when I knew he'd missed dinner. I kept the apartment clean, trying to impose some small sense of order on the chaos I knew he was feeling inside. They were small, inadequate gestures, like offering a cup of water to a man dying of thirst, but it was all I had. I was just the quiet friend, the steady background presence. I didn't know how to fix him. I didn't know how to even begin. The first time it happened, it was born of a desperation so palpable it felt like a third person in the room. It was well past 2 in the morning, and the low, rhythmic sound of a thunderstorm was rumbling outside. I was woken by a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was so tentative I thought at first I'd imagined it, a phantom sound created by the storm. Then it came again, a little louder. Julian. His voice was a strained whisper, barely audible over the rain drumming against the window pane. I sat up, my heart starting a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Leo? What's wrong? The doorknob turned slowly, and he appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the faint light from the hallway. He was just standing there, holding a pillow, looking like a lost child. I can't sleep, he said, and the vulnerability in his voice was a physical blow. My room. It just feels too big. Too empty. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a frantic scramble of possibilities, of protocols I didn't possess. Do you want to talk? I asked, my own voice thick with sleep. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement in the dark. No. Can I? He trailed off, gesturing vaguely towards the floor with the pillow. Would it be weird if I just crashed in here? On the floor. The request hung in the air between us, charged with everything that was unsaid. It was a plea, not for a place to sleep, but for proximity. For the simple, animal comfort of not being alone in the dark. My room was small, barely big enough for my own bed and a desk, but the size of the room was irrelevant. A chasm had opened up in our friendship, and he was asking me to help him cross it. My throat was tight. Yeah, I managed to say, the word feeling too small for the moment. Of course. It's not weird. He gave a small, grateful nod and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't turn on a light. He just laid his pillow and a blanket he'd brought on the small patch of rug beside my bed. I listened to the rustle of fabric as he settled in, the soft sigh he let out as he finally lay still. The storm raged outside, but inside my small room, a different kind of weather system was forming, one of quiet intensity and unspoken need. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of his presence just a few feet away, his breathing a steady, reassuring rhythm in the dark. It was the beginning of the ritual. The floor became his refuge. It wasn't every night at first, just the bad ones, the ones where the silence in his own room became too loud to bear. He never made a big deal of it. He would just appear at my door, a ghost in the twilight hours, pillow in hand, and I would let him in. We never spoke of it in the morning. He would be gone before I woke up, the blanket folded neatly on the floor where he had slept, the only evidence of his nocturnal visit a faint indentation in the carpet. It was a secret we kept, even from each other, a silent agreement that existed only in the space between midnight and dawn. But as the weeks wore on, the nights he spent on my floor began to outnumber the nights he spent in his own bed. The pretense of it being an occasional thing slowly eroded, until it was just the new shape of our lives. I grew accustomed to the soft sound of his breathing, to the sense of another person sharing my space. It was a strange and delicate dance of intimacy and distance. He was closer to me than he had ever been, yet we never acknowledged it. The unspoken rule was that daylight would erase the night's vulnerability. In the kitchen, making coffee, we were just roommates. On the pool deck, we were just teammates. But in the quiet darkness of my room, we were something else, something undefined and fragile. I was living a double life. By day, I was the stoic, supportive friend. By night, I was the guardian of his sleep, the silent witness to his sadness. And every night, I would lie in my bed, my body tense with a mixture of profound tenderness and agonizing restraint. He was right there, so close I could have reached out and touched him, and the effort it took not to do that was a physical ache, a constant, low-grade fever in my blood. I wanted to comfort him, to offer more than just a patch of floor, but I was terrified that any move I made would shatter the delicate truce we had built. To offer more would be to reveal the truth of my own heart, and that was a risk I still wasn't brave enough to take. So I lay still and listened to him breathe, and I told myself, again and again, that this had to be enough. Then came the night that the boundary between the floor and the bed dissolved. It was a particularly cold night in late November, the kind where the wind rattled the window frames and seemed to seep through the very walls. He had come into my room as usual, but after an hour of listening to him shift restlessly on the floor, the soft sounds of his discomfort were fraying my nerves. He shivered, a small, audible tremor in the quiet room. I couldn't stand it anymore. The careful wall I had built around my instincts crumbled. "Leo," I whispered into the darkness. He went still. "Yeah, you're freezing. Get up here." The words were out before I could stop them, before I could analyze the consequences. They were a simple, humane command. A long silence followed, so long that I thought he was going to refuse, that I had finally pushed too far and broken the spell. Then, I heard the rustle of his blanket. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice small. "I don't want to." "I'm sure," I said, my own voice firmer than I felt. "It's stupid for you to be freezing on the floor when there's room." I shifted over, creating a space on the edge of my double bed, and held up the corner of my comforter. It felt like a monumental gesture, an offering of immense weight. He hesitated for another moment. Then he stood up and slid into the bed beside me. The mattress dipped with his weight. He lay stiffly on his back, on the very edge of the bed, as far from me as he could get while still being in it. The space between us was a live wire, crackling with a tension that was entirely new. We were no longer separated by the floor. We were sharing the same space, the same air, the same blanket. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. We lay like that, two rigid forms in the dark, not speaking, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow, shaky breath, and some of the tension seemed to leave his body. He shifted slightly, turning onto his side, his back to me. It was a small movement, but it felt like a concession, an acceptance of this new proximity. I remained on my back, staring at the ceiling, my entire consciousness focused on the man lying beside me. The ritual had evolved. The line had been crossed, and I had no idea what it meant, or where we would go from here. All I knew was that the quiet observer had just invited the subject of his entire world into the frame, and nothing would ever be the same. The bed became the new normal. The floor was forgotten, a relic of a previous, more cautious era. Every night, he would come into my room and get into my bed without a word. The initial stiffness and awkwardness slowly melted away, replaced by a comfortable, practiced familiarity. Proximity bred a new kind of intimacy, one measured in inches and accidental touches. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to find his arm thrown across my chest, or his leg tangled with mine. He was a restless sleeper, and in his unconscious state, he would seek out warmth and contact, migrating across the mattress until he was pressed against my back. My nights became a landscape of heightened sensory awareness. I learned the specific weight of his arm, the soft texture of his t-shirt against my skin, the way his breathing would deepen and even out just before he fell into a deep sleep. Each touch was a paradox, a source of both profound comfort and exquisite pain. I was being given a version of the one thing I wanted most in the world, but it was a counterfeit version, a closeness born of his need and not, I was certain, of his desire. He needed a warm body, a human anchor in the dark, and I was simply the one who was there. I was a substitute, a stand-in for the comfort he had lost. I told myself this every night, a mantra to keep my hope from growing into something wild and unmanageable. But hope is a stubborn, insidious thing. It grew anyway, in the dark, nurtured by the warmth of his body next to mine. It whispered to me in the quiet moments, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, this meant something more. That maybe the lines were blurring for him, too. It was a dangerous thought, one that I tried to push away, but it was always there, a faint glimmer in the suffocating darkness of my own restraint. This clandestine intimacy began to seep into our daytime lives in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The boundary between our nighttime closeness and our daytime friendship started to fray at the edges. He would stand a little closer to me when we talked, his shoulder occasionally brushing against mine. He initiated physical contact more often, a hand on my back as we walked through a doorway, a casual arm draped over my shoulders on the couch while we watched a movie. To anyone else, they were the meaningless, easy touches of close male friends. To me, they were charged particles, each one sending a jolt through my system. I was a seismologist, and my entire world was a fault line, constantly registering the tremors of his proximity. I became a frantic interpreter of a language I was not sure he was even speaking. Did that touch linger for a second too long? Did the look in his eyes when I made him laugh hold something deeper than amusement? I was trapped in a feedback loop of analysis and anxiety, dissecting every glance, every gesture, every word, searching for a sign, a clue, that I was not alone in this feeling. My photography became my only outlet. I couldn't capture him anymore. It felt too intimate, too revealing of my own obsession. So I turned my lens to abstract things. The way light hit a water glass, the texture of peeling paint on a windowsill, the intricate patterns of frost on a window. I was trying to capture the feeling of my interior world, the fragility, the tension, the quiet beauty, and the unbearable ache of it all. My art became a reflection of the unspoken thing between us, a series of images that were beautiful and lonely and full of a quiet, desperate yearning. The swim season was hurtling towards its end, towards championships, and the pressure was mounting. The training became more intense, the exhaustion more profound. We were living in a state of perpetual fatigue, our bodies pushed to their limits daily. This physical exhaustion seemed to amplify the emotional intensity between us. After a brutal practice, we would get into his car, the silence thick with more than just tiredness. It was a shared history now, a silence filled with the knowledge of our nightly ritual, of the unspoken intimacy that defined our lives. And that brings us back to this night, to this car, to this empty parking lot. We had just finished the last truly grueling practice before the taper for the final meet. Our bodies were humming with fatigue, our minds blessedly empty. The drive home was usually a quiet communion, a shared recovery. But tonight, something was different. I could feel it in the way Leo was gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. I could feel it in the tense set of his jaw, illuminated by the passing streetlights. He was radiating a nervous energy that was entirely different from his usual post-practice exhaustion. He was a wire pulled taut, vibrating with a frequency I had never felt from him before. He drove past the turnoff to our apartment complex. I didn't say anything. I just watched, my own heart starting a slow, heavy beat of apprehension. He continued on for another mile before turning into the deserted parking lot of a long-dead shopping center. He pulled into a space facing the darkened storefronts, shifted the car into park, and cut the engine. And the silence that rushed in to fill the void was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a silence made of 1,000 other silences. It was made of all the nights we had lain side by side without speaking, of all the things I had wanted to say and hadn't, of all the questions he had never asked. It was a dense, physical thing, pressing in on me from all sides. He didn't move. He just sat there, his hands still resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the cracked facade of a business that had probably closed down before we were born. The only light came from a single, buzzing sodium lamp that cast a sickly orange pallor over everything, draining the world of color, rendering the moment stark and theatrical. I watched his chest rise and fall, a slow, deliberate rhythm. My own breathing felt shallow, insufficient. My mind, usually a hive of overanalysis, was unervingly blank. It was as if my entire being was holding its breath, waiting. The quiet observer in me was gone, replaced by a participant who had no lines and no blocking, thrust onto a stage without a script. The seconds stretched into minutes. The hum of the cooling engine ticked away like a metronome, counting down to something I couldn't name. I could feel the question forming between us, a tangible shape in the charged air of the small car. He was wrestling with it. I could see it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way he swallowed hard. And I knew, with a sudden, terrifying certainty, that whatever happened next would be the end of the world we had known. It would be an extinction-level event for our friendship as it was. We would either be destroyed by it, or we would be reborn into something entirely new. Finally, he turned his head. He looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like he was truly seeing me. Not just Julian, his roommate, his teammate, his friend. He was seeing the man who had been lying next to him for months, the silent keeper of his grief. His eyes, in the strange, flat light, looked impossibly deep, like the dark water at the bottom of the pool. They were filled with a confusion, a fear, and a desperate sincerity that stole the air from my lungs. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. He closed them again. He was searching for the words, the right words, and their absence was more eloquent than any speech. He was as lost as I was. In that moment, the carefully constructed personas we wore, the confident athlete and the quiet observer, fell away. We were just two people, sitting in a car in the dark, terrified of the truth that had been growing between us, a wild and untended thing. He finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper, rough and uncertain. Julian. It was just my name, but the way he said it, it held the weight of a confession. It was an admission of everything we had been avoiding. Yeah, I whispered back, my own voice a stranger to me. He looked down at his hands on the steering wheel, then back up at me. The vulnerability in his expression was absolute. It was the same look he'd had in my doorway all those months ago, but magnified, intensified. He was on the edge of a cliff, and he was asking me if it was safe to jump. Can I ask you something stupid? A small, humorless smile touched my lips. The familiar line, the one he used before asking for help with a class or borrowing money, now felt like a desperate piece of driftwood in a churning sea. Always, I said, the word a solemn vow. He took a breath, a shuddering intake of air that seemed to cost him everything. His gaze held mine, unwavering, searching. And then he asked the question that I had both dreamed of and dreaded, the question that would either save me or shatter me completely. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The buzzing of the street lamp, the distant hum of the highway, my own frantic heartbeat, it all went silent. There was only his question, hanging in the small space of the car, glowing with a terrifying, beautiful light. It was not a proposition. It was not a move. It was a plea for permission. It was an act of surrender. He was giving me all the power, laying his own confusion and fear and one at my feet, and asking me what to do with it. And in that moment, all my own fear, all the years of careful self-protection, all the walls I had built brick by painful brick, they all evaporated. There was only this boy, this man, my friend, my everything, looking at me as if I held the answer to a question he didn't even know how to formulate. My answer was not a word. A word felt too clumsy, too loud for the sanctity of the moment. I simply nodded. A small, single, deliberate inclination of my head. It was consent. It was permission. It was a yes that echoed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken yes that had been living inside of me for years. His relief was a visible thing, a wave that washed over his features, softening the tension around his eyes. He leaned across the center console, his movements slow, tentative, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He was giving me every possible chance to pull away, to change my mind. I stayed perfectly still, my entire universe having shrunk to the few inches that separated our faces. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and cupped my jaw. His thumb brushed against my cheek, the touch feather-light, electric. It was the first time he had ever touched me with such clear, unambiguous intent. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a gesture of friendship. It was a prelude. He searched my eyes one last time, a final, silent question. I met his gaze, and I hoped he could see everything I couldn't say. The years of waiting, the depth of my affection, the terrifying, overwhelming relief that this was finally, actually happening. Then, he closed the remaining distance, and his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or fire. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was soft, hesitant, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question asked in a different language, a language of touch and pressure and warmth. It tasted of uncertainty and a deep, soul-shaking yearning. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. It lasted only a few seconds, but it redrew the entire map of my world. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, the silence between us no longer a void but a shared, sacred space. "Okay," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. It wasn't a question or a statement. It felt like an anchor finding purchase after a long time at sea. "Okay," I whispered back. And in that small, shared word, a new world began. The drive back to the apartment was conducted in a dreamlike state. We didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened. The kiss had created a new reality, and we were both fumbling in the dark, trying to understand its shape and texture. When we got back, the familiar routine of our evening was suddenly alien. We showered separately, the sound of the water in the pipes a lonely reminder of the new space between us. I went to my room, my mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. I didn't know what to expect. Would he go to his own room? Would the spell be broken by the harsh fluorescent light of our hallway? I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart a frantic bird in my chest, and I waited. Minutes later, my door opened. It was Leo. He didn't have his pillow or his blanket. He just stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he walked over to the bed, pulled back the covers on his side, and got in. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, and I lay down beside him, doing the same. The silence was different now. It was charged with the memory of the kiss, with the terrifying potential of what came next. After a long while, I felt his hand move across the small space between us, his fingers tentatively brushing against mine. I turned my hand over, palm up, an invitation. He threaded his fingers through mine, his grip tight, almost desperate. And that's how we fell asleep. Not touching in any other way, just our hands clasped together in the dark, a silent, fragile promise. The promise, I discovered, was more fragile than I knew. I woke the next morning to an empty space beside me. It wasn't unusual for him to be up first for an early class or a morning workout, but the coldness of the sheets told me he'd been gone for a while, and our hands were no longer clasped. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, staring into a coffee mug as if it held the secrets of the universe. He looked up when I came in, and his eyes slid away from mine almost immediately. A wall was up, a sheet of mirrored glass where yesterday there had been an open window. "Hey," he said, his voice clipped, unnaturally casual. "Morning," I replied, my own voice cautious. I tried to catch his eye, to find a flicker of the person who had held my hand in the dark, but he wouldn't look at me. He was all nervous energy, moving around the kitchen with a jerky, unnatural purpose, avoiding my presence as if I were a magnetic pole repelling him. The beautiful, terrifying intimacy of the night before had vanished, replaced by this brittle, awkward performance. It was like watching a bad actor try to play the role of Leo, the roommate. He was failing miserably. He finished his coffee in 2 quick gulps, rinsed the mug, and headed for the door. "Got a study group," he mumbled, his hand already on the doorknob. See you later, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence he left in his wake was a cold, cruel thing. It mocked the warmth I had felt just hours before. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the dark of his car was already starting to wilt under the harsh, unforgiving light of day. The next few days were a special kind of hell. Leo was a ghost in our own apartment. He was there, and yet he wasn't. He found 1,000 reasons to be gone: study groups, extra lifting sessions, meals with other friends. When he was home, he was distant, retreating into his room or behind his laptop, creating a digital and physical barrier between us. He was polite, terribly so. The easy banter, the shared jokes, the comfortable shorthand of our friendship, all gone. We spoke in the stilted, careful language of strangers who happened to share a living space. Every polite, "How was your day?" felt like a slap in the face. The man who had sought me out for comfort every night for months now couldn't even meet my gaze. The bed in my room felt enormous, an empty continent of loneliness. He didn't come to my door. The ritual was broken, the silent agreement voided. I lay awake each night, listening for the phantom sound of his footsteps in the hall, my body aching with a phantom limb-like sense of his absence. The pain of it was a physical thing, a hollow space in my chest that grew with each passing hour. It was worse than the years of silent pining. Before, I had the solid comfort of our friendship. Now, I had nothing. The kiss had not been a beginning. It had been a demolition. He had taken a sledgehammer to the foundations of our world, and now he was walking away from the rubble, leaving me to stand alone in the wreckage. The hurt was quickly hardening into a cold, sharp-edged anger. Anger at him, for his cowardice, and anger at myself, for being a fool, for daring to hope, for believing that a moment of shared vulnerability could possibly translate into something real. The breaking point came at the end of the week. I couldn't live in the suffocating silence anymore. The unspoken tension was a poison, and it was killing me slowly. I came home from my last class to find him, for once, in the living room, staring blankly at a muted television screen. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the vibrant energy that was so much a part of him was gone, replaced by a weary, haunted look. My anger wavered, momentarily replaced by a pang of concern. But I pushed it down. I needed answers more than I needed to protect him. I walked over and switched off the TV. The sudden silence made him jump. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a hunted, cornered panic. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet, but it held a core of steel I didn't know I possessed. He flinched. "Julian, I'm really not. No." I cut him off, the single word sharp and final. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me, and then treat me like I'm a stranger. You don't get to turn our home into a minefield of awkward silences. I deserve more than that. Our friendship deserves more than that." I wasn't shouting. My voice was low, controlled, but it trembled with the force of all the hurt and confusion I had been holding in. "So talk to me, Leo. Tell me what's going on. Tell me the kiss was a mistake. Tell me you were confused. Tell me you regret it. Hell, tell me you were drunk, even though we both know you weren't. Just say something. Say anything. Because this silence is unbearable." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. The confident, articulate Leo was gone. In his place was someone I had never seen before, someone completely undone. He looked down at his lap, unable to meet my gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what to say. Try." I pushed my patience worn thin. "Start with why? Why did you kiss me, Leo?" He shook his head, a gesture of profound frustration. "I don't know," he repeated, louder this time, the words cracking with desperation. I looked at you, sitting there, and for the past few months, you've been the only thing that's felt real. The only person who saw me, really saw me. And I wanted to. I had to. It felt like the only honest thing to do." He finally looked up at me, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. And the second it was over, I panicked. "It's not. This isn't me. I date girls. I've always dated girls. It doesn't make any sense." And I thought if I just ignored it, If I pretended it didn't happen, it would all go back to normal, he laughed, a bitter, self-deprecating sound. But it's not normal. Nothing is normal. I feel like I'm losing my mind. And I'm so terrified of losing you that I've been destroying the one thing I was trying to protect. His confession hung in the air between us, raw and painful and utterly honest. All the anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. He wasn't being cruel. He was just scared. He was terrified of what the kiss meant, not just for us, but for his own understanding of himself. He had spent his whole life navigating the world with a clear map, and in one impulsive, honest moment, he had set that map on fire. And he was lost. I crossed the room and sat on the couch next to him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. You think I'm not scared? I asked, my voice soft now. Leo, I've been in love with you for years. The words came out, simple and unadorned, and the relief of finally saying them was dizzying. It was like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. What? I've been in love with you. I repeated, the words easier the second time. Watching you with Sarah, listening to you talk about her. All of it. And these last few months, having you so close, sleeping in my bed every night. It has been the most beautiful and the most painful thing I have ever experienced. So yeah, I'm scared. I'm terrified. Because what you did in that car, it gave me a glimpse of something I never, ever thought I could have. And then you took it away. And I thought I had imagined it all. That I was just a moment of confusion for you. A warm body in a cold bed. He just stared at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. It was as if I had just handed him a Rosetta Stone to a language he had been hearing his whole life, but never understood. The little things, the way I looked at him, the quiet things I did for him, it was all being recontextualized for him in real time. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice full of awe and regret. Julian, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I know, I said. That was the point. We sat in a new kind of silence. It was not the comfortable silence of old, nor the painful silence of the past week. It was a silence of revelation, of truths laid bare. It was fragile, but it was clean. He was the one who broke it. So what does this mean? He asked, gesturing to the space between us. What are we? It was the question I had been asking myself for months, and I still didn't have a simple answer. I don't know, I said honestly, but I know what we're not. We're not just roommates anymore, and we're not strangers. We're something else. And maybe we don't have to put a label on it right away. Maybe we can just start here, with this. With honesty, I looked at him, and I saw not the sun god of the swim team or the broken man after a breakup, but just Leo. My Leo. Confused and scared, and trying his best to be brave. The only thing I know for sure, I continued, my voice steady, is that I don't want to go back to pretending. And I don't want to live in this silent, awkward world you've created. I want my friend back. And if there's a chance for something more than that, I want to be able to explore it without being terrified that you're going to vanish again. He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. A decision was being made in the quiet depths of his eyes. Okay, he said, the words solid, certain. No more vanishing. I promise. He took a deep breath. And, for what it's worth, I don't think it was a mistake. The kiss. I think it was the first time I've been completely honest with myself in a very long time. And it scares the hell out of me. But the thought of going back to the way things were, of you not knowing, that scares me more now. He finally closed the distance between us, shifting on the couch until his knee was pressed against mine. The simple point of contact was grounding, a reassurance that this was real. Can we just take it slow? He asked, his voice full of a new, tentative hope. Figure it out? Together? Yeah, I said, a real smile finally reaching my lips. Together. I'd like that. That conversation was the foundation for our new beginning. We started to build something new in the ruins of what had been, slowly, carefully, one honest brick at a time. The awkwardness didn't vanish overnight, but it began to recede, replaced by a gentle, deliberate tenderness. We learned to talk. Really talk. He would tell me about his confusion, his fear of what people would think, his struggle to reconcile this new part of himself with the identity he had worn his whole life. I would tell him about the years of quiet longing, about the loneliness of loving someone in secret. We were mapping out the uncharted territory of our own hearts for each other. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. That night, after our talk, as we were getting ready for bed, he paused at the door to his own room. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just looked back, leaving the choice entirely up to him. After a moment, he gave me a small, shy smile and walked past his own door and into mine. When he got into my bed that night, it wasn't as a refugee seeking comfort. It was as a partner, making a choice. He turned to face me, and I turned to face him. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin. "Hi," he whispered, as if we were meeting for the first time. "Hi," I whispered back. He leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was a kiss of quiet confidence, of a shared future. It was a promise. Our lives found a new rhythm, a new normal. It was a quiet, domestic thing. We made coffee for each other in the morning. We held hands under the table in the dining hall. We fell asleep wrapped around each other, his head on my chest, my arm around his waist. The grand, terrifying chasm of my secret love had been crossed, and on the other side, I had found not a wasteland, but a quiet, peaceful home. The world outside our apartment continued on, oblivious. To the team, we were still just Leo and Julian, best friends and roommates. We hadn't announced anything, hadn't put a label on it for anyone else. It didn't feel necessary. What we had was ours, a private world we were building together, and it was too new, too precious, to expose to the judgment of others just yet. Our sanctuary was in the small moments. The way he'd grab my hand and squeeze it when he thought no one was looking. The soft, private smile he'd give me from across a crowded room. The profound, uncomplicated peace of just existing in the same space, knowing we were finally on the same page. My photography changed again. I started taking pictures of him, but not the stolen, lonely shots of before. I captured him in our new life. Leo laughing in the morning lights streaming through our kitchen window, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand resting on my thigh as I drove. The peaceful, unguarded expression on his face as he slept beside me. They were not images of yearning anymore. They were images of joy. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something cataclysmic, a storm that threatens to tear down everything you've built. They wear the camouflage of fear, the plain clothes of a painful confrontation or a terrifying confession. You don't recognize them as moments of creation until much later, when you look back and see the timeline of your own heart, not broken, but remade. The parking lot, the kiss, the painful silence that followed, they weren't the end. They were the necessary demolition before a new construction could begin. We had to tear down the comfortable, dishonest structure of our friendship to build something stronger, something more true. We had to learn the language of vulnerability, to speak our fears aloud so that they might lose their power. One evening, a few weeks into our new beginning, we were lying in bed, tangled together, the room dark and quiet except for the sound of our breathing. He was tracing patterns on my arm with his finger, a lazy, absent-minded gesture. "You know," he said softly into the dark. For the longest time, I felt like I was drowning. After Sarah, after everything. Just treading water, trying to keep my head up. But every night, coming in here, it was like finding a life raft. He paused, and I felt him press a soft kiss to my shoulder. "But I was wrong," he continued. "You're not the life raft, Julian. You're the shore." And in that moment, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, I knew we were finally, truly home.